Let's jump right into this explainer. When we think of the Emancipation Proclamation, we usually picture this grand moral triumph, right? A beautiful humanitarian decree that forever altered the fabric of the United States. And look, while it absolutely became exactly that, the document itself was actually born out of something much, much more pragmatic. Today, we're going to look at the Emancipation Proclamation not just as a declaration of freedom, but as a literal strategic weapon. We'll see exactly how Abraham Lincoln leveraged the powers of his office to completely dismantle the Confederacy's war machine. So this brings up a really fascinating question. Was the Emancipation Proclamation primarily a military tactic? It's kind of a mind-bending way to reframe history, isn't it? We all have this preconceived notion that ending slavery was the Union's main goal from day one of the Civil War. But early on, Lincoln actually insisted his paramount object was just to save the Union, not to save or destroy slavery. He absolutely knew he lacked the constitutional authority in peacetime to just ban the institution outright. So to make this monumental move, he had to find a totally different justification. Just listen to Lincoln's exact wording from the final proclamation that went out on January 1st, 1863. Notice how he didn't ground this document in sweeping philosophical language about human rights. Nope. Instead, he wrote that he was acting by virtue of the power in me vested as commander-in-chief and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. See that? He framed it entirely as a military necessity. By basically defining enslaved people in the rebelling states as a critical asset to the enemy, Lincoln effectively gave himself the legal authority to seize and thereby free that very asset. Section 1. A necessary war measure. By the summer of 1862, the Union desperately needed a new approach. Lincoln's cabinet definitely recognized this need for a massive strategic shift. In fact, Secretary of State William Seward advised him to wait for a major military victory before even announcing it. He didn't want it to look like the Union's last shriek of retreat. And that victory? Well, it came at Antietam. This fundamental shift in the Union's strategy literally changed everything. Instead of just preserving the Union, the new objective became ending slavery to destroy the rebellion. Lincoln realized that as long as slavery remained intact, the Southern rebellion would always have a foundation to rebuild upon. He had to strike right at the root. By making emancipation an explicit war aim, he wasn't just freeing people, he was actively dismantling the entire economic and logistical foundation of the Confederacy. Section 2. Crippling the Confederate engine. To really understand why this was such a devastating blow, we need to look at how the Confederacy actually operated. Slavery wasn't just some cultural institution in the South, it was the literal engine of their war effort. The Confederacy relied entirely on enslaved labor to keep their military functioning while their white citizens went off to fight. I mean, think about it. Enslaved people were forced to produce and prepare food for the troops. They sewed the uniforms. They repaired the critical railway lines. They built the military fortifications and even served as hospital workers and common laborers. Now, the Confederacy didn't officially allow enslaved men to serve as soldiers until the very last month of the war, but they absolutely 100% depended on them as the backbone of their logistics. By declaring these people free, Lincoln was directly targeting the South's supply chain. And wow, the result was immediate. Slave escapes just completely crippled the Southern economy. When news of the proclamation spread, and let me tell you, it spread rapidly by word of mouth through what was known as the grapevine, it caused general confusion for the Confederacy and ignited massive hope for enslaved people. There was even this informal network run by enslaved people, sometimes called the 4Ls, or Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, that brought news of the proclamation to secret meetings on plantations. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved people seized their freedom and escaped toward advancing Union lines, which completely drained the South of its vital labor force. But you know, the strategic brilliance of the proclamation wasn't just limited to American soil. Let's look at Section 3, a global strategic shift. Lincoln essentially set up a massive international roadblock here. The Confederacy was desperately seeking official recognition and military intervention from European powers, particularly Great Britain and France. And honestly, they came pretty close to getting it. But by explicitly making the eradication of slavery a Union war goal, Lincoln completely flipped the script. Britain and France had already abolished slavery. Public opinion in those countries was strongly anti-slavery. So there was simply no way the governments of Britain or France could justify intervening on behalf of a nation fighting to preserve slavery, especially when the Union was now openly fighting to destroy it. The American diplomat Henry Adams actually recognized this masterstroke. He noted, "The Emancipation Proclamation has done more for us than all our former victories and all our diplomacy." It was an absolute diplomatic triumph. It essentially guaranteed that the Confederacy would have to fight the Union alone, without any official foreign military intervention, completely isolating the South on the world stage. Section 4. Arming the Emancipated. We've talked a lot about how this maneuver took labor away from the South, but what did it actually do for the North? Well, the document included a provision that was totally revolutionary. It explicitly allowed for former slaves to be received into the armed service of the United States. Early in the war, enslaved people who escaped to Union lines were somewhat awkwardly classified as contraband of war, meaning their legal status was super uncertain. But this specific clause in the proclamation officially opened the doors for Black men to pick up arms and fight for their own liberation, as well as the preservation of the Union. Just take a second to let this number sink in. Nearly 200,000. That is the number of Black men, a vast majority of them formerly enslaved, who joined the Union military. This was just a massive infusion of manpower at a time when the Union desperately needed it. So, while the South was watching its labor force flee, the North was simultaneously bolstering its ranks with highly motivated soldiers who understood exactly what was at stake in this war. And this brings us to an incredible quote from Union General Ulysses S. Grant. This was written in an 1863 letter to President Lincoln. He observed that arming Black soldiers, combined with emancipation, is the heaviest blow yet given the Confederacy. Grant saw firsthand on the battlefield how this policy completely devastated the South's ability to wage war, while simultaneously energizing the Northern military machine. Section 5. From Tactic to Legacy. Think about it. What happens when a war ends? If your justification for freeing millions of people is purely a military necessity, does that freedom just vanish when the guns fall silent? Lincoln was deeply worried about this. The proclamation was issued in 1863, but because it was an executive order tied specifically to the war effort, there was a very real legal fear that the courts could just overturn it in peacetime, or that it wouldn't apply to those who hadn't physically escaped during the war. So, in 1864, Lincoln staked a massive part of his re-election campaign on a permanent constitutional solution. He relentlessly pushed a reluctant Congress to act. And finally, by December 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, officially and permanently banning slavery throughout the entire United States. The calculated wartime measure had quite literally paved the way for permanent constitutional change. Which leaves us with this final, profound question to consider today. How different would American history be if Lincoln hadn't found a military justification to strike at the institution of slavery? A document criticized by some at the time as reading like a dry bill of lading ultimately broke the back of the Confederacy, kept Europe out of the war, put 200,000 Black soldiers into Union blue, and set the absolute stage for the 13th Amendment. It's a brilliant reminder that sometimes the most profound moral leaps forward are achieved through cold, calculated, strategic action. I hope this explainer gave you a whole new perspective on this incredible piece of history. Thanks for joining us, and keep asking those big questions.